established by the United Nations some many years ago. And it's my duty and honor today to talk to you at Philips Israel about Koninklijk Philips, or as we know it as in English, Royal Philips, which was founded in 1891 by Gerard Philips and his father Frederick. And they were one of the major electrical companies in Europe, if not the world. 4 years later, the Philipses, father and son, were forced to bring in the younger brother of Gerard. His name was Anton, who had studied engineering. And together with Anton, between 1908 and 1912, so in a matter of 4 or 5 years, they developed Philips into a major force in Europe. By 1922, the Philips companies based out of Eindhoven, but elsewhere as well in the Netherlands, were going into business partnerships in Europe, in joint ventures, with the likes of the German company Osram, which was owned by AEG Siemens and Augesellschaft, and they opened up factories all over Europe, and particularly in Poland. To the next slide. On the 9th of May 1940, the Philips directors heard that what was happening was Germany was about to invade. And we've got over here a presentation as to, on an hourly basis, what it was like to be in the Netherlands at the time. It took the Germans no more than 5 days to conquer most of the Netherlands. And what had happened was the directors of Philips and the board of Philips decided what they were going to do was move as much as they possibly can, as quickly as they possibly can, over to North America, the safety of the Atlantic between them. So Anton Philips, together with his son-in-law Franz Otten, moved with the board to North America, where they set up North American Philips Company. But the company was actually domiciled, Philips International, Philips Koninklijk Philips, the Royal Philips was actually domiciled in the Netherlands Antilles in the Caribbean, which was actually under the protection of the British at the time, because Germany had invaded, as much as the United States later on. Fritz Phillips, however, and we've got a picture of him coming up shortly, he was the son of Anton, and he was the only person of the Philips family to actually remain in the Netherlands. Let's hear the ambassador of the Netherlands understanding what had happened to his country in a public broadcast on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen Wilhelmina.
Seldom has there been in history a more unwarranted violation of good faith on the part of any nation, and a more brutal attack on all that is decent in the relations between cultured states, as we are witnessing now on the part of Germany. True to its principles, the Netherlands are resisting this attack to the fullest extent of their power, and they will fight on as long as there remains one German soldier on Netherlands soil.
And unfortunately, the Dutch capitulated 5 days later, and Fritz Phillips was the only member of the Philips board, he was a director as well of the company, to actually remain in the Netherlands. So next slide, please. The joke was, as far as Fritz Phillips was concerned, he was 35 years old at the time, that the reason why he didn't join his family in North America was because he was a supporter of PSV Eindhoven, and there was one thing he would not do, even under German occupation, was miss a football match by PSV Eindhoven. Fritz Phillips himself, next slide please, is credited with saving personally 380 Jews in the German occupation of the Netherlands in World War II. And he himself was recognized in 1996 by Yad Vashem as a righteous amongst the nations. The background to Philips, I've told you about, but what you don't understand is the Netherlands. It's a kingdom. And the Queen of the Netherlands at the time, Queen Wilhelmina, came to the throne of the Netherlands 1 year before Philips was established. So during her time on the throne, all the way through to 1961, she was an integral part of the Dutch business scene as much as she was a businesswoman, just as much as she was a member and a leader of the royal family of the Netherlands, the House of Orange. The Dutch had possessions all over the world. They had the largest and most successful, not only Philips company, but also the Fokker company, creating aircraft sold to civil aviators all over the world. It was a major force. Problem is that the British didn't like the system that they had planned for themselves in case of an invasion, whereas Princess Juliana should actually be sent together with her husband to the United Kingdom, leaving the royal family and all the members of the government to be under occupation by the Germans. So there are two stories. The first story is that the Dutch royal family wanted to stay there, but Winston Churchill wouldn't allow it. Why? Because the Netherlands was the fifth largest oil producer in the world, taking consideration the East Indies as much as the West Indies, as well as all the other elements of the colonial power that the Dutch had that would fall automatically into the hands of the Germans. So they forced Queen Wilhelmina's hand to join her daughter in exile, but Queen Wilhelmina was a Dutch lady, and she said, if I go, not only does the entire royal family come with me, we've already got Juliana in England, but apart from the extended family, all my ministers come with me as well. I cannot leave them here. Not only my ministers, but also my senior civil servants. Not only the senior civil servants, but also members of the upper echelons of the defense and security services and the diplomatic corps. Not only that, but also their families will come. And Winston Churchill bowed to those concessions. So literally the entire government of the Netherlands moved over to be a government in exile in England. What happened was when the Germans did occupy the Netherlands after a 5-day war, they found no one in charge. Even senior civil servants and local government officials in town halls weren't available for them. So what did the Germans do? Next slide, please. Is that they called upon Berlin to send to them someone who'd already cut his teeth in the occupation of Poland. His name was Seyss-Inquart, a nasty man. You'd seen his activities under Hans Frank in the General Gouvernement, which was that part of Poland which was a colony of Germany. How he was torturing, instructing people to torture the Polish intellectuals and killing them. How he himself was instructing people to deal badly with the Jewish inhabitants and also with the gypsies and various other undesirables under his governance. And now this man was literally given an open checkbook by Adolf Hitler, only reporting to Hitler himself in how he actually manages the Netherlands under occupation. What could Phillips do under such circumstances? Well, Seyss-Inquart, the man you see in front of you, appointed 2 German businessmen to join the board of Philips Netherlands. Already we are talking about a takeover also of commercial enterprise, but left Fritz Phillips basically in charge, because otherwise he would face the same problems that he faced with the dock workers in the docks of the Netherlands when they went on strike. But he didn't give Fritz Phillips any much hope. And what Fritz Phillips did was saying, no, this is not good enough. What we're going to do is we're going on strike ourselves. And Fritz Phillips himself was arrested and taken to prison, where he languished for many weeks until they conceded to him the wishes that he was able to manage the affairs of the companies without too much control by the 2 Germans that they had installed on the board of Philips Netherlands. What happened was Seyss-Inquart decided that he's going to do something completely different as well. The only country outside the Reich under occupation which did not have any concentration camps was suddenly going to have a concentration camp. That's the Netherlands. France never had a concentration camp. Belgium, Luxembourg, you name those countries. None of them had concentration camps. But Seyss-Inquart insisted that his country has its own concentration camp so he can deal with the political prisoners, that he can deal with the people that he didn't like and he didn't want, in a manner that was pertaining to the way how the Nazis operated in Germany and in the East. So he decided that what he was going to do was convert a transit camp that had been used, apart from Westerbork, called Vocht, which was only a few buildings, into a fully fledged concentration camp, the only concentration camp outside Germany. And construction work began on May 1942, with 36 living and 23 were working barracks. If you go to the next slide, please. What happened was that the British bombed the Phillips factories in December of 1942, just after work had commenced on Vocht. And to say the least, the Germans were none too happy about the operation, which the British called Operation Oyster, which actually not only damaged the factory, but also killed and maimed Dutch workers and civilians. So very quickly, the opportunity arose for the Germans to set up within Vocht a works, a barracks, which would be a production barracks. And the first people from Phillips to be sent to Vocht was actually while the camp was still in course of construction on January the 15th of 1943. A series of 3 commands came out of the Seyss Airquart, saying that it's going to be run exactly the way how concentration camps had been run in Germany, whether it's Dachau, Sachsenhausen, the earlier camps. And what he did was take in commandants from Germany to be able to run his concentration camp. The first one was Chmielewski, who was a commandant of Mauthausen. Didn't last very long because he was bent as a 5-bob note or a 25 shekel bill. The next one from October of 1943 was the ex-commandant of Dachau and Sachsenhausen, Grunwald. He didn't last very long either because of the way how he was treating the people in the camp who were political prisoners, and word got back to Seyss Airquart what he was doing. In fact, there was a murder, bunker tragedy in January of 1944 where 74 female prisoners were detained in a cell in Vocht, which was 9 meters square. Could you imagine 74 people in a 9 meter square cell, and people died of suffocation? So they ditched him, Grunwald. And finally, the last person to take over Vocht was someone called Hans Huttig, who was no better than the first. And unfortunately, he also came a cropper. And even before the Allies conquered that part of the Netherlands, or reconquered that part of the Netherlands, he was out and he was back in Natzweiler, where he came from. They had 3 different camps in Vocht, 3 different conditions of camp. One was the Judenslager, which was the Jewish camp. The other one was the security camp called the Schutzhaftlager, and then there was the Phillips command, the Phillips commander. And in the time period from 1943, which was when they started in earnest developing the manufacturing capabilities there, all the way through to June of 1944, which is when the first Phillips Jews left on a deportation to Auschwitz. People were working flat out in the Phillips Commander. Could you go to the next slide, please, and where we listen to a lady who was in Vocht? How are we doing on the video?
Close to the Phillips factories, and all the young men had been sent to Germany, and the top guys who were necessary, they had an exemption to go to Germany, but they said to the Germans, we need Dutch people, we need people to work here, we need laborers to do the work, why don't you send some busloads of those prisoners every day? And then they were fed terrific by those Dutch guys. And Phillips makes radios, there was no TV yet, so the Germans couldn't constantly watch. So those prisoners who worked there, they loved it. They got food from the Dutch. And if any of the Germans was gone, they put the BBC on, so they heard all the latest news. And they told it in the camp, so the Landers knew all the latest news.
So if you prepare the next slide to come through, which is the continuation of the testimony by Belinda, The first prisoners from Phillips to arrive was, as I said, on January the 16th of 1943. These prisoners came from either the Phillips works or also a number of them who came from Amersfoort, which was another transit camp that the Germans had set up, but they were about to abandon. The people who arrived at the Phillips works in Vocht were actually famished and abused. People don't realize that the German occupation of the Netherlands was one of the most awful occupations of any country in the West. The Netherlands is a very small country. Everyone knows everyone else. It's impossible to hide away. And what happened was that as soon as the Germans got to grips with the occupation of the Netherlands, they started shipping out any of the able-bodied younger men to Germany. They didn't want to go, obviously. They didn't want to leave their families. They didn't know what slave conditions they were going to head for in the East in working for the Germans. But then again, it was very difficult for anyone to hide away in this place. So Phillips themselves was quite a haven for them. If you could actually work for Phillips, even if you were working as a slave laborer in Phillips, you got fed well, you got very decent working conditions, and not only that, but you got a special pass that stopped you being taken away to Germany to act as a slave laborer there. The thing about Phillips also, well, apart from the general well-being of their people, was that they protected them, and they protected them as best they possibly can. Let's listen to the second part of Belinda's testimony, where she says something very, very cute, and I thought it was worthwhile putting this in. I always like it when someone talks about what they were doing inside the camp. It was hidden away from most people's view. But can we see what article she actually created when she was in the barracks in the Vocht camp? Thank you, David.
Did you and some of the other women embroidered handkerchiefs? Could you show this and explain what it is?
When you left your house in the time, there were no tissues. The last thing your mom always yelled when you were at the door, do you have your handkerchief? Because that's terrible. And when I was arrested, I had my handkerchief. And then when I was in Vught, somebody had a needle, and they got the idea, and I did it to them. And we could borrow, and from each other clothes we took thread, so you just pulled it out. And so here I embroidered, and every night you could have the needle for about 7 minutes, and then under your blanket. So that you did. And here I did the date that I was arrested. And then here it must have been from somebody's stock in Scheveningen, that was the prison. And then this was, if you looked up, high up, there was this window. And I was there in the A corridor, cell 306. And this was the Kubbelton, and you had to go to your bathroom. And this was 5:45 every morning. And then they wanted to call Dutch, but they said, allemaal opstaan, everybody gets up. And then I was brought the night of the invasion, June 6. We were brought to that concentration camp Vught. Right. And I was in barrack 4, and that was here. When you walked, you saw this big wall, and here the 4. And there we were in rows of cots, metal cots, with long rows 3 high, and I was in cot 25 in the middle. And then here we got once a month the package of the Red Cross, so I did long live the Red Cross. And here
Mrs. Diet Eman, who was born in 1920 in The Hague, and she mentions Scheveningen. Most of you have heard of the Anna Frank diary, the Anna Frank story. She actually came. Anna Frank's family actually had a holiday home in Scheveningen. And I can remember meeting Otto Frank when I was a kid in Scheveningen on a number of occasions when we went there on holiday. So it's a close story. So we talked about the Phillips Commando, but the last convoy from Vocht to Auschwitz, as Germany was failing generally, they were moving people around, was actually on June the 3rd of 1944. Up until that time, Phillips workers were sent to Auschwitz, But they were not stopping in Auschwitz. They came to Auschwitz, which was a distribution point, to go into a subcamp of Auschwitz, which was a subcamp also of Gross-Rosen, which was also a subcamp of Auschwitz, to a place called Reichenbach. So anyone who worked for Phillips got a pass that took them in a cattle car. It was awful transport, but took them in a cattle car to Reichenbach, a subcamp of Auschwitz, which was actually operated by a long-term partner of Philips Netherlands, Telefunken. Telefunken were building their electronic devices for the Wehrmacht, and most of the people who were sent from Vught to Auschwitz arrived quite safely in Telefunken, in their factory in the subcamp of Auschwitz. In fact, whereas in the Netherlands itself, by the end of the war, 85% of the Jewish population of the Netherlands were killed, murdered, died. 85% of Philips workers sent to Auschwitz survived. What made the figure 85% was the last transport from Vught to Auschwitz on June the 3rd of 1944. Up until that time, they were so valued, the Philips workers, that Fritz Phillips made it possible that every single one of them could survive, as long as they could survive the horrendous journey that they had, days on end, under wartime conditions in cattle cars. 517 workers arrived in Auschwitz on June the 3rd of 1944. The problem is that 160 of them survived the transport. 2/3 of them women, and out of the 160 people who survived, 9 were children. 357 Philips workers were killed by the Nazis on arrival in Auschwitz that day, 3rd of June of 1944. Taking suddenly the figure of survival rate working for Philips down to 85%. If you just go over to the next slide, we'll finish off over here talking about Philips, because on October the 27th, 1944, the 5th Cameroon Highlanders reached Vught and freed the remaining prisoners, inmates of Vught. Today, what you find in Eindhoven is on the right-hand side a statue to Fritz Phillips. You can see him there below the statue, celebrating his 100th birthday in where else but PSV Eindhoven grounds. And to the left-hand side, you can see the memorial to the Jewish people who were killed in either Vught or the Vught transports to Auschwitz and Sobibor. If you can't visit the statue of Fritz Phillips in Eindhoven, I'm sure he would be even more than happy that you actually visit his beloved PSV Eindhoven grounds, because that was his love of his life. Let's continue to a personal story about someone who was actually working for Philips, not a director of Philips, not even a senior manager of Philips, but someone who was working for Philips in Warsaw. If you can go to the next slide, please. The most important thing we learn from Elie Wiesel and the likes of Elie Wiesel, who survived the Shoah, the Holocaust, is that we have to remember those good people who helped Jews during the Holocaust. We must learn from them in gratitude and hope. We must remember them. Here's a picture of Elie Wiesel at the time of his release from a concentration camp, and to the right, just before he was Nifta, some 10 years ago. Next slide, please. Because in 1963, Yad Vashem decided that what they're going to do is create a commemoration for those people who saved lives, Jewish lives. And they started a worldwide project, next slide please, for Righteous Amongst the Nations. As of 2020, some 27,712 individuals have been awarded, and couples have been awarded Righteous Amongst the Nations. Next slide, please. Władysław Kowalski was actually born in Kiev in 1896. There's a picture of him. You've gone too far. In 1896. He studied in St. Petersburg agronomy, And at the time, Poland had been divided since 1875 between the three great powers of the time, Germany, Prussia, Austria, the Habsburg Empire, and the Tsarist Russia. And he had studied agronomy in St. Petersburg. Before he could actually take up a job in agronomy, he earned his degree in 1915. He took up the fight in the Great War, which became the First World War, by joining the Polish brigades of the Russian army. And eventually the Polish brigades of the Russian army turned on the Bolsheviks when the Russians decided in 1917, 1918 to invade Poland and retake Poland, because the Poles had started to establish their own governance there, because the Bolsheviks had collapsed in the East under the pressures of the war as well as the revolution. So Władysław Kowalski actually fought for his beloved Poland. He was a Pole, and fought for its independence, and continued in the Polish army until 1935, retiring with the rank of colonel. But he was an aristocrat, and he was also of the Polish officer class. But the difference between him and most other Poles was that he had a positive attitude towards Jews. When he was demobilized at the age of 39, he started working for Phillips in Warsaw. Phillips, as I said before, had started working in Europe in conjunction with lots of other, in joint ventures with lots of other companies. And in Poland, it was with the German Osram company that in 1922 they set up a lamp works, which then expanded from there. So when the Nazis invaded Poland on September the 1st, Kowalski headed back to the Polish army, was involved as a colonel of a brigade in the defense of Warsaw. When it was all but given up hope, and his commandant was saying to him, no, surrender now, don't try and fight on, he actually fought on for another 2 weeks in the defense of Warsaw. And he was one of the main reasons why the Germans never took Warsaw as quickly as they possibly could do. And eventually, when he was defeated in Warsaw, him, together with thousands of other officers and NCOs, non-commissioned officers, sergeants and the like, were taken into awful captivity by the SS, who had no concern and no consideration at all to the Geneva Convention. The Netherlands, as you know, was neutral at the time of the start of the First World War, and someone at Phillips' headquarters must have been watching the Red Cross, which was producing lists that the Germans have actually provided them of Poles who were in captivity. Any of the officers were actually listed on a Red Cross listing, Polish officers, all the way through to February of 1940. From February 1940 onwards, the Germans did not provide the Red Cross with any information. Phillips must have heard about the incarceration of their local man in Warsaw, Mr. Kowalski, or Colonel Kowalski, and secured his release. Again, this shows you how Phillips cared for their employees at the time. I wonder how many other companies would do such a thing rather than upset the Germans and let their employees languish in prisoner of war camps. He comes home to Warsaw, and there in the summer of 1940, a few months after he had got home, he meets in the street a boy, 17 years old, teenager, called Bruno Borel, who approaches him poorly dressed, saying, "I haven't eaten in 3 days. Please help me. I need some food." Well, what does Colonel Kowalski do? Władysław takes him back home to his 111 in Pańska Street, which, by the way, today is near the Modern Museum of Art in Warsaw. The house doesn't exist. It was bombed, as you will see later on, by the Germans in the Warsaw defense. And he feeds him. Not only does he feed him, but he also provides him with an identity card. Okay, it was a bogus one. It was forged, but it was good enough to be able to pass muster. Gives him also a work pass to Phillips factories, and puts him up with a friend of his in round the corner from where he lives. So he's given Bruno a new life. And Bruno actually survives the war, because he's of the documentation, because he's got ration cards, he actually survives the war. And he can tell us about this. What has Kowalski done? Can you go to the next slide, please? Because what you will see over here is a flyer. Okay, this is from 1941, but it was the same text that was broadcast in 1940 when the Germans were occupying Warsaw, which shows you what the Germans threatened to do to any person who helped the Jews. Next slide, please. It says, I remind you that Jews can only be in the designated residential area, and if they're not, they're punishable by death. This was the formation of the Warsaw Ghetto. And if you do help a Jew, whether you help them by sleeping overnight in your place or giving them food and whatever have you, or you're helping them by purchasing their valuables, etc., at the end of the day, you're dead. And at the end of the day, they're also telling the local Poles, please report not only the Jews, but also anyone who's helping the Jews to the local police station, where you will be rewarded. So what Kowalski does, well, is against the grain of everyone was scared of the Germans. Not him. Next slide, please. What you will see over here is a series of videos which shows you what the conditions were like in the Warsaw Ghetto. It's a sealed ghetto. No one in, no one out. It was actually a silent movie. This was done at the time by a German film crew, showing you what life was like in the ghetto. Food was down to 180 calories a day. Just imagine it. You've got one slice of bread and a little bit extra, and that's it. That's the food that you have for the day. People were living, 450,000 people, in an area which was 2% of the area of Warsaw, surrounded by the wall that you see over here. And the way how they sorted out accommodation was on the basis of 7 faces per window. Just think about the windows in your bedroom. How many windows do you have? Because if you've got 1 window in your bedroom, that means 7 people are sleeping in that 1 room. 2 windows in your bedroom, 14 people. That was fair, because you had to put everyone up. Next video, please. So apart from all of this, what you have is water, electricity, and gas being cut off. Who's going to pay for a house in multiple occupation? And if you don't have any water, that means you don't have toilet facilities. There's no sewerage. If you don't have electricity, you don't have any gas, it means how do you heat the place? How do you prepare food? Well, you're only getting 180 calories a day in any case. 140,000 people, 1/3 of the ghetto, die in the ghetto itself. And by the way, as I said before, these films were actually made by a German film crew, and most of it is staged, though the people are real. In other words, those are residents of the ghetto. And you can see them literally starving to death. Of 145,000 killed, died, starvation, public health problems, out of 450,000. It was really bad. So this is the sort of thing that Radzislav Kowalski saw with his own eyes. He had a special pass to get into the Warsaw Ghetto because he claimed that he had employees of Phillips in the Warsaw Ghetto. He also claimed that there were people in the Warsaw Ghetto that owed Phillips money. So he could go in and out of the ghetto on this special pass just as much as he could travel the whole of Poland on the passes that the Germans provided him. After all, Phillips was now supplying much needed equipment to the German, both the civil and military establishments. And he was going in and out of this ghetto with food, with medicine, and also bringing people out. We know for a fact, and I've got names here, and I don't mind distributing my little booklets that I've created out of this. We know of many tens of people that he saved, but the numbers are in the hundreds rather than the tens. Let's move on to 1943-44. So if you don't mind going to the next video, please. Because after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of January of 1943, when the Jewish fighters in the Warsaw Ghetto chucked the Germans out for a period of 2.5-3 months, there were no Germans within the ghetto. Finally, when the Germans actually do come back inside the ghetto, and they clear out the ghetto building by building. What they do is set fire to those buildings, mortar them, blow them up until you see piles of ruin. Then the next year, 1944, the Russians had been coming closer and closer, 300 kilometers away from the capital city, Warsaw, and they stop. The Poles decide that this is the time that they are going to create their own uprising, which they do, and that was brutally put down as well. So what you see over here is an aerial photograph taken by the Russians after they've entered into Warsaw, showing you the destruction of Warsaw. This is the ghetto area, which is literally destroyed, and that's the church, which is the only church that's the only building that actually survives in the Warsaw Ghetto till today, apart from one or two other tenement buildings, as you see it. Władysław Kowalski, though, has decided at the time of the Jewish uprising, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, that what he was going to do was going to create a sub-basement to his house at 111 Paniewska Street. Not only does he create a sub-basement, which is large enough for 100 people, but what he does is he ensures, because he is, after all, an engineer, that they've got a good water supply, drinking water supply, so that he's able to live for extended periods of times in that basement. Joining him in that basement for 120 days are 50 people. 50 people who he has to feed and look after, not under German occupation, but in an area which is now completely deserted, and you can't walk above the surface because you would be spotted a mile away. This is the sort of conditions he was living in. For 120 days, until the Russians came and liberated Warsaw, he looks after 50 people. Ladies and gentlemen, we're coming to the final stages of the story of Władysław Kowalski. So the next slide, please. He stays on in Poland for another few years, but he marries one of the ladies that he saves to, whose first husband had died. She's a widow, together with the son, Moshe Michael, as he's called, Bachholz. 10 years later, they decide what they're going to do is move to Israel. He moves to Haifa when he arrives in Israel. This is a picture of him in Gedera, which is where he lived, in Bat Yam, closer towards the end of his life. Next slide, please. He is well liked by most people in Israel, but he doesn't actually find much luck in work. He works in various shops, and eventually in the last 2 years of his life, he works for Yad Vashem. In 1963, the year that they announced that what they've got is righteous amongst the nations, he is actually one of the first people, in the groups of the first people, to actually be awarded with the certificate and the medal by Yad Vashem. And this is what you see him being presented in Yad Vashem, with a certificate and medal for being righteous amongst the nations. He's divorced now from his wife. They've had a baby girl together in Israel. He's living alone in a convalescent home and in an old age home in Gedera. And in 1971, he dies. One of his last wishes when he dies is that he wants to be buried amongst his Jewish friends. If you can go to the next slide, please. I want to read to you an extract from Haaretz magazine, a newspaper. The body of Polish Colonel Władysław Kowalski lay in a morgue in Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv for 5 days after he died. Nowhere in the country could a cemetery be found that would agree to his final request to be buried amongst his friends, the Jews. The rabbinate was unwilling to compromise on its principles so that a Christian could be buried in a Jewish cemetery. The fact was that he saved hundreds of people, but he couldn't be buried in the Jewish country. Finally, a kibbutz agreed to bury Kowalski. The kibbutz was Yad Mordechai, named after Mordechai and the Levitz. We find the following report in also Haaretz. I decided to concentrate on one newspaper, that Artek Weineman, the secretary of the kibbutz of Yad Mordechai, said the following at his graveside when they buried him there. With mixed feelings, we agreed to the request to bury him at the kibbutz. On the one hand, we saw this as our obligation, that this individual, we agreed to his request to be buried amongst his Jews. On the other, we asked the hurtful and insulting question, why was this person, Władysław Kowalski, who did so much for the Jews, not laid to rest in a central locale where survivors can visit him and honor the memory of this man? So we have his grave at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai. In honor of Kowalski's body resting in our kibbutz, Artek Weinemann says, his wonderful character and his great deeds will serve us and our children as a symbol of the good and the pure in the human race, and will reinforce us to believe and hope that the brotherhood of nations will ultimately overcome racial hatred and brutal nationalism. Next slide, please. It wasn't until 1971 that I could find another article in, 2012, that I could find another article in Haaretz on Władysław Kowalski. They report in 2012, mystery surrounds righteous Gentile who saved dozens of Jews. It's an article by Ofer Aderet in the Hebrew version of Haaretz, and it says the following. Vered Bar Sameach, the director of the Yad Mordechai Museum, they have a museum to the Warsaw Ghetto, visited the grave of Władysław Kowalski. Her father, Artek Weinemann, had been responsible for helping to arrange it buried there 41 years ago. And since then, she reports, no friend or relative of Kowalski has ever visited the grave or contacted the kibbutz. I'm a daughter of the kibbutz, Vered goes on to say. I live and work here, and I don't know anything about this story. All these years I knew there was a grave here, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Nor has anyone touched the archival material we have about this person. By the way, he's actually buried between two Holocaust survivors in Yad Mordechai, one of which is David Jakubowicz, who's a native of Poland. But why should the story end here with this article from 2012? Because what I want to ask you, Phillips Israel, is where is his wife buried? Mrs. Beckholz, the one was saved. What happened to their son, their adopted son? Either Moshe or Michael. They say he goes by the name of Vardi, according to some people, surname Vardi. Where is the daughter that was actually born to them both? What's happened to her? Why did the family not remain in contact with the kibbutz after he was buried? There are still questions today that need to be answered. And maybe not only answered by those of you listening to me here and bringing the message to Phillips in Israel, but currently Phillips, according to the records, employs 7,000 people in Poland, the home of Władysław Kowalski, in 4 production plants, plus management and sales organizations. Maybe they should be made aware that something needs to be done to be able to tell the story of Władysław Kowalski and the wonderful people at Phillips who saved Jewish lives. Thank you very much indeed, and I've left 15 minutes for questions, as agreed.